It's the first year of the Second Age. The War of Wrath has just ended, and the victorious forces of the Valar now return to the west. However, not all the elves were willing to forsake Middle-earth, in which they for so many centuries had suffered in their wars against Morgoth. Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor, now established the Grey Havens, and his kingdom stretched far and wide. Men there were also who had fought for the West in the Great War, and they were gifted the Isle of Elena by the Valar as a reward for their efforts. These men became known as the Númenóreans, the High Men, and they were taught great wisdom and given power and life more enduring than any other mortal race have ever possessed. The Dwarves had also fought in the war, but their cities lay mostly in ruins following the destruction of Beleriand. A great part of the dwarves that abode in the Ered Luin now migrated to their grand mansion of Khazad-dûm, where many dwarves now dwelt. When rumors spread that the precious metal mithril was found in Khazad-dûm, many elves settled west of the mountains and founded Eregion. There they built the city of Osinethil, and a great friendship prospered between the elven smiths and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. For many centuries, these lands prospered, but then came the day when Gil-galad sent a letter to the king of Númenor with great concerns. A new shadow was growing in the east, thought to be led by one of Morgoth's servants. This power was no other than Sauron, who for centuries had corrupted the hearts of men, continuing his master's works. Sauron desired the dominion of Middle-earth, and he began the construction of the fortress of Barad-dûr and devised cruel plans. While men were easily corrupted and quickly fell under his dominion, the elves who held the greatest power would not so easily submit to his rule. Sauron, therefore, sent out emissaries to elven lands, offering his guidance, and he took the fairest shape he could contrive. Gil-galad and Elrond perceived evil in Annatar, and did not permit him in Mithlond. But in Osinethil, the elves received him gladly. For in that land, the Noldor desired ever to increase their skill and craftsmanship. Also, they were not at peace in their hearts, since they had refused to return to the west, and they desired both to stay in Middle-earth, and yet to enjoy the bliss of those that had departed to the west. Therefore, they hearkened to Annatar, and they learned of him many things, for his knowledge was great. Sauron guided their work, and he secretly devised a scheme, for his desire was to govern the elves. Thus, it was that the elven smiths reached their peak of smithcraft, and the rings of power were created. But Sauron departed Eregion, and in Orodruin he forged in secret a master ring, designed to control the lesser rings. With the ruling ring, Sauron intended to perceive the very thoughts of the ring-bearers, and even control them. But the elves were not so likely to be caught, for they immediately became aware of Sauron's intentions when he put on the One Ring. Narya, Nenya, and Vilya, the greatest of the lesser rings, were sent away in secret and given to the wise. When Sauron learned of the revolt of Celebrimbor, his disguise fell, and his wrath was revealed. The Dark Lord now gathered a great force under his banner in the east, and he intended to obtain the rings of power through warfare. Orcs, men of darkness, and other evil creatures answered Sauron's call, and they marched out from the Black Land, prepared to devastate Middle-earth. The great force crossed Kalanarthorn, and the invasion of Eredor began. When Gil-galad was informed of Sauron's advance, he deemed with his wisdom that the Noldor had not the strength to defy the power of the East. Therefore, he sent at once messengers to Númenor, asking for aid. Simultaneously, Elrond Half-Elven gathered a force, and headed to Osinethil with great haste. But Sauron went at once for Osinethil, eager to capture the rings of power. The scouts of the Dark Lord were already approaching the city, but Celeborn had long prepared a sortie. The elves rushed out of the city towards their enemy, and Sauron's vanguard was taken completely by surprise. Fierce fighting took place, but the master smiths of the Gwaith-i-Mírdain hammered down upon their opponents with terrible ferocity, and few could defy their wrath. Celebrimbor drove the vanguard back, and Sauron's force was for a time repelled. But the defenders were only given a brief respite, for the enemy now surged forward with great strength. It was in this hour that Elrond arrived with his host, and gave an essential reinforcement. But the elves were heavily outnumbered, and was driven northwards, away from the city, and the Siege of Eregion took place. Thousands of orcs and men were slaughtered at the city walls, and they were heaped in piles. But the defenders were too few, and at last the attackers broke into Eregion with great ruin and devastation. The lesser rings of power were retrieved by Sauron, but the 3 elven rings were not to be found. Not even under torment would Celebrimbor reveal their location, but Sauron guessed the truth, for he deemed that the 3 had been committed to elvish guardians. In black anger, he turned back to the battle, and all his hatred was directed towards Elrond's force. Elrond had gathered all the remnants of Eregion, but he could not withstand this onset. His host was soon to be surrounded, but help came in this dire hour. For Durin sent out a force of dwarves from Khazad-dûm, and with them came the Elves of Lorenan. The dwarves charged with a loud war cry, and their axes struck their enemies with terrible ferocity. Sauron's rearguard was driven back, and Elrond did not hesitate and extricated himself. His force advanced north, and took refuge in a valley, and established there a stronghold. Imladris was its name, and it became ever after a refuge of hope. Meanwhile, the dwarves and elves retreated back inside Khazad-dûm, for their forces could not hope to have victory, being greatly outnumbered. Sauron managed not to enter the west gate, and Khazad-dûm bore ever after his hatred. The dwarven colonies in the mountains were at this time attacked by orcs, and fell for a time under their influence. But Sauron had now another desire, to conquer the entirety of Eredor, and he ravaged the lands, slaying or drawing off men and elves. Imladris was besieged, and the Dark Lord now marched towards Mithlond, where he believed that he had the most chance of seizing one or more of the 3 rings. Meanwhile, at the River Lune, Gil-galad's forces hastily prepared for the incoming assault. For many years, the Númenórean ships had landed at Mithlond, building up a force and gathering supplies of war. But the promised Númenórean navy had not yet arrived when Sauron's force clashed into Gil-galad's defense, and the times were grim indeed. Sauron now besieged Imladris, who was soon to overrun the River of Lune, and more armies under his influence were also on their way. It was in the very nick of time that Tar Minastir's armament arrived. The first force landed at Mithlond to the rescue of Gil-galad, while the second force landed further south at the port of Vinalonde. The Númenóreans rushed into battle, and they were tall and terrible. The great cohorts of the king's archers sent before them a shower of arrows with their steel bows, and their enemies were filled with dread and horror. Kiriatur and Gil-galad advanced, and Sauron's forces were pushed back to the river crossing of Baranduin. But the power of Númenor and Lindon was too great, and Sauron's servants perished in the thousands. Sauron now retreated eastwards to be reinforced, and at Tharbad he merged his forces. But Sauron suddenly found himself outmaneuvered, for the second Númenórean host came upon his rear. In the Battle of the Gwathlu, Sauron was routed utterly, and he himself barely escaped the Númenórean wrath. His small remaining force fled from Eredor, but was pursued, and in the eastern parts of Kalenarthon they were once again assailed. Sauron, with no more than a bodyguard, escaped from this onset, but the humiliation was complete. Simultaneously, the forces of Gil-galad came to the rescue of Imladris. Sauron's last army was utterly destroyed, being caught between Elrond and Gil-galad. Sauron had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Númenóreans. Though the forces of the West had won a heroic victory, their losses were not few. Eregion was no more, and its people had perished. Eriador lay largely in ruins, and it would take many years to heal its wounds. It was at this time determined that an elvish stronghold in the east of Eriador should be maintained rather at Imladris than in Eregion. And the Númenóreans had tasted power, and came to Middle-earth, establishing permanent settlements, guarding the west against Sauron. The Dark Lord had been defeated, and his power was greatly diminished, but he still held his mastering in the fortress of Barad-dûr, and the lesser rings had been retrieved. Sauron vowed vengeance upon the Númenóreans, and he intended to destroy even Númenor, if that might be. If you are interested in lore from Tolkien's Legendarium, make sure to check out these videos right here. Remember to subscribe and consider supporting me on Patreon or Teespring to show your support.